Hello and welcome to the Model Kit for Beginners learning course, in which I'm going to be teaching you how to build this Airfix Spitfire MkXVIII in 1/48 scale and paint it using this cheap airbrush from Amazon. This course is designed for those of you who want to improve your skills and want to start painting with an airbrush. I'll be using basic techniques perfect for a beginner, but in such a way that we can still achieve a great result. Thank you very much for buying the course. I hope you find it useful, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions or just want to say hi, you can find me on these platforms. Also, once you finish the course, take a picture of your work and share it using the hashtag #TScaleMB. I look forward to seeing it. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the first chapter of the Model Kit for Beginners learning course, where I teach you how to build and paint your model kit with an airbrush. In this chapter, we're going to be building and painting the cockpit, focusing on getting a high quality fit and finish. I'm going to keep things simple and easy to follow. This course is about the basics, and the results you see here are achievable for anyone.
Now let's go to the instructions. Taking a look at step 1, we can see the part numbers are circled. A12 is the cockpit sidewall, and D14 and D34 are the two smaller pieces being added to it. Now it's simply a case of finding the correct sprue, frame and part, according to the number, frame A, part 12. Sprue cutters or snips can be used in two main ways, to cut the part flush and to leave excess sprue as demonstrated. This is useful for when you need to take extra care removing the sprue from a part. We can see on the back of this part 3 small circles. These are the ejector pin marks, a result of the moulding process used to create the kit. Sometimes it leaves residue which can be easily removed. Checking the instructions before removing anything to make sure you don't accidentally chop off something important. Once the part is off, you can come in from a far better angle and use a precise cut of the snips to cleanly remove the remaining sprue. You can also use a knife in a pulling motion, parallel to the face of the part, to remove the excess sprue. Be careful not to dig into it and take off a chunk of wanted plastic. This technique takes some getting used to, but once you're proficient, it's very quick and handy. Another knife technique is scraping. Using the blade edge at a perpendicular angle to the part face, lightly scrape along the surface where you want to remove plastic. Using a sanding stick is another way to remove excess sprue and clean up a part. Here we have different levels of sponginess to the sticks. For removing large amounts of residue, you want a firm stick with a low grit. This will take off a lot of material quickly. Then move to a higher grit to smooth the surface. Sanding sponges are useful on curved parts as they conform to the shape of the surface. Now I'll show you how to cut off and clean up smaller parts using the seat, step 3 and 4 as a demonstration. Cut out the seat using the snips and leave excess sprue. Then do the same for the smaller pieces, applying pressure slowly and carefully to stop the part from flying off the sprue. Now get your cutting mat and knife, holding the piece firm to the mat, apply controlled pressure to the excess sprue in a chopping motion. You can also use the blade to carefully slice off the remaining plastic. Use very light pressure as to not injure yourself or break the part. Alternatively, you can use a small sanding stick to remove the excess. Now you can practice these techniques on the remaining parts. Experiment with how you hold the knife to find what works best for you. Just remember to use light pressure and let the blade do all the work. If you find it not cutting well, just switch out the blade for a new one. Now we're going to look at gluing the parts together. These three products from Tamiya are great. If you're trying to move away from using the standard cement tubes included in starter sets, I'd highly recommend picking these up. Extra thin cement works by capillary action, in which it flows quickly in narrow gaps or cracks due to its surface tension, meaning it will glue parts together that are already touching. Extra thin cement quick set does exactly what it says on the tin, it sets quicker. It's also very potent. Tamiya cement is a thick solvent adhesive. This needs to be applied to the parts before joining them together. Let's join the seat to the seat frame. These two parts butt up against each other, guarded by a small raised edge. Tamiya cement will be the best for joining these, as we're simply sticking two flat faces to each other. Carefully apply a small layer of cement to the edge of the seat and lower it in place using tweezers. The glue takes a few minutes to dry, so there is time to adjust the part once they're connected, but try to be as accurate as possible to save yourself the hassle of fighting the glue. Now do the same for the other side. Once you're happy that everything's in the right place, apply a small amount of pressure to the parts and then set them aside for a few minutes to allow the glue to harden. Another way of using these glues is in two stages, using cement to stick the part where you want it and then apply extra thin cement to fuse the parts together. This is particularly useful on small fiddly parts like the seat height adjustment lever on the side. Here I use cement on the locating pins to hold the lever in place whilst I apply extra thin to fuse the parts together. Once you've finished the seat, have a look at the instructions and think about the next few steps. At this point, we need to start considering how we're going to paint these parts and what would be the best way to set ourselves up. For steps 1 and 2, add the small details and we'll hand paint these with a brush. Step 3 and 4 are mostly complete, but leave part A22 unattached as it'll be easier to paint them separately. Leave the two parts of step 6 unattached and complete steps 5 and 7. For step 8, leave the parts separate as B08 is solid black, so it'll be easier to paint it separately. Now looking at the next page, we can see the cockpit assembly. Before we can put the cockpit together, we need to paint all the pieces. So cut off and clean up the remaining parts included up to step 16, but don't assemble them. Take care when cleaning up the fuselage halves and use the techniques you've learnt so far to remove the excess sprue. Making sure we get a good clean removal of these parts is vital as they're the most visible. If you do make a mistake here, however, don't worry because in the next few episodes I'll show you how to fix it. When you're done, you should have something looking like this. Using the instructions, we can group the parts based on colour, laying it out clearly for painting. Here we have all the parts that will be green. These will all be silver, and this will be black. The fuselage halves will be two colours, but first we'll paint them green with the larger batch of parts. When it comes to holding each piece, here's a method I've been using for years and it works great. I've got an ever-growing collection of cotton bud sticks, which I put a ball of blue tack on and then attach the part to it. This makes it easy to hold when painting, and it also saves the environment as I'm reusing this highly disposable item. Try and place the parts on using an area that won't be painted. This might sound obvious, but the worst thing is painting all your pieces, then taking them off the sticks to find a bright white patch of unpainted plastic, right where you don't want it. Another way of holding parts is using tweezers. This nifty style of tweezer clamps on release, so it holds it without any work from you. These are perfect for a part that doesn't have a large space to stick on the blue tag, just like this piece. I've placed the tweezers at the bottom and we can see that the seat will nicely cover up that area just in case we forget to paint it. Now let's prep the rest of the parts. Once everything is ready, we can set up our workspace for painting. I'm using kitchen paper to protect my surface from the paint. You could also use newspaper or any kind of covering. Having something light coloured helps us test the paint flow later on. I'll also be using these powder-free latex gloves to both protect my hands from the paint and also protect the parts from any grease or fingerprints which might show through after painting. This is one of the key ways to getting a good finish on your model, taking care of the parts. I've chosen to use Tamiya acrylic lacquers to paint the cockpit, mainly XF71 Cockpit Green. This is Tamiya's equivalent to Humbrol 78. These paints work well with an airbrush and can be thinned easily with X20A thinner. To mix them, I'll be using these Amazon shot cups, which are a great size and can be washed out and reused. These 3ml pipettes are also great for measuring our paint and thinner ratio. In this case, I'll be mixing 50-50. Here I've put in 1 ml of paint and 1 ml of thinner, and then mixed them together. The mixture should have a similar consistency to milk, and you can adjust as required, but usually 50-50 will do just fine with these Tamiya paints. Put the paint in the colour cup using the pipette to keep things mess free. Then at an air pressure of between 15 to 20 psi, I prefer 17 psi, test the paint on a bit of paper and get used to the handling of the airbrush and the trigger. Once you're happy that the paint is flowing nicely without any splattering or blocking, go ahead and grab one of the pieces of the sidewall. Now in a nice steady motion, begin to lightly apply a layer of paint. The first layer should be a light dusting as you're spraying directly onto bare plastic. This will act as a primer layer, then the subsequent layers will build up the colour. Be careful not to flood the surface. This will take some practicing, but once you get used to the movements and the paint consistency, you'll be able to apply even coats. These sidewall parts are perfect to start on because of their relatively large flat surface. If you feel like you need to, you could also practice on the inside of the fuselage parts at the tail, as this won't be visible. Once you've given all the parts their first layer of paint, we can start to build up the colour. To do this, we're going to maintain the steady motion and even coverage, but increase the amount of paint we're putting on the surface by pulling back on the trigger a little bit more. Again, making sure not to flood the surface. There will be some trial and error, so don't beat yourself up if you don't get it first time. Less is more with airbrushing, so it's better to play it safe and build up lots of thin layers than it is to flood the surface with paint and destroy all the small details on the part. A quick tip, if the airbrush starts spitting and blocking, put some thinner in the colour cup, stir it around and rinse the airbrush out by placing your finger on the end of the nozzle and pulling back on the trigger slowly until it bubbles. Then spray out the thinner and start painting again. Repeat this until you get an even flow. Blocking is commonly caused by paint drying on the needle, so think of it as if you're washing off the needle without taking the airbrush apart. Now continue to build up the layers on all the other pieces until you get a solid colour. On the fuselage halves, I try not to paint the lower area as this is where we're going to be gluing on the cockpit tub, so it's best to not cover it in paint. Now to paint the instrument panel, I'll be using MRP Black. MRP is the range of paints I'll be using for the camouflage. These paints are lacquer based and are very potent, so you should absolutely wear a mask and have good ventilation in your painting area, not something you should be painting at the kitchen table. They can be airbrushed straight from the bottle at around 17 psi with no thinning required. In the instructions it tells us to paint the rear part of the cockpit in silver, along with the parts that sit there. This means that we'll have to mask off the green areas. For this I'll be using Tamiya masking tape. It comes in these handy dispensers and in a range of sizes. These are a must for any tool set. Follow the instructions to mask off the green section accordingly. I'm adding enough tape to cover up the green areas entirely. This protects it from any overspray. A point to note is that all the areas we're painting silver are not actually visible at the end. So if you want to, you can skip this colour entirely. It's good to also do a quick check of your masking before painting. I then go around the edge of the tape with a pair of tweezers to make sure that it's properly pushed down onto the surface. If it's not, you might get paint leaking underneath the tape. To paint the silver part, I'll use a paint called Alclad 2 Metal. This is an excellent range of metallic lacquer paints. Specifically, I'll be using AL119 airframe aluminium. These can be handled the same as MRP, so painting between 15 to 20 psi straight from the bottle with no thinning. These paints work best on a gloss black base, but because this won't be seen, I'm putting it straight onto the previous colour. Following the same airbrush principles, in nice controlled motion, slowly build up the layers until you get an even colour. Remember to paint the two former pieces. Once you're happy with the colour tone, leave it for 10 minutes to fully dry and then peel off the masking tape, making sure to peel back on itself and not directly upwards, as this may cause paint to be ripped off the plastic. Now if you've masked everything in the right place, the painting should nicely line up when put against the fuselage halves. After painting all the parts in their base colours, we can start to paint the details. We'll do this by using a brush and acrylic paints. Acrylic paints can be thinned and cleaned with water and they dry quickly. This makes them great for brush painting and easy to use for a beginner. Here are two of the brands I use, Revell Aquacolor and Vallejo. Both are very common and can be found in most hobby stores or online. Let's use the Revell Aquacolor Red and the Vallejo Black. For washing out the brushes, I use this old plastic cup filled half full with tap water. Now for the brushes. Here's a Raphael Kolinsky Sable size 5.0 in the 8404 series. This is what I use on the fine details and it costs around £15 on Amazon. These are high quality sable hair brushes. But I also have an Italeri round brush size 3.0 and a flat brush size 2, which is good for covering larger areas. These only cost around £1 or £2, so are much more affordable. However, they are of a slightly lower quality, but for what we're going to be painting, they're more than enough. Step 1 calls out the two smaller pieces as Humbrol 85 Coal Black, but we're going to keep things simple and paint them just standard black. We're also going to paint some of the other moulded details in black too. You could also use reference pictures to add additional details if you want to. For example, I'm going to paint the door escape tool in red, as it's seen in these photos. Adding extra colours to the cockpit will make it more interesting to look at in its final form. Let's start with the black. Give the bottle a good shake and drop some paint onto a palette of your choice. You could use a wet palette, a tray, a piece of paper, or anything you have. Here I'm using an offcut of the packaging. Dampen the brush and start to add the paint. If you get too much paint on the brush, just wipe it off on a paper towel. If you put too much paint on the part, clean off the brush and then dampen it, and then you can spread the paint out on the surface. For the seat, I'm covering the large area with the flat brush and then using the detail brush for the edges and the corners. Experiment with the angle that you hold the part to help your brush hand be more comfortable and so giving you more control. Now I'm going to show you a great technique called dry brushing. This involves putting paint on a brush and then trying to take off as much of that paint as possible before then lightly brushing the part. This process then highlights the edges and the raised details, giving a great paint effect, making the details pop out. It's best to use an old flat brush, but if you haven't got one, you can just cut the tip off any old brush to make it flat. I'll be using this acrylic metal paint from Ammo, but you can also do this with any colour you want. It works best if it's a contrasting colour from the base, so silver or light grey for black. Dip the brush in the paint and then simply wipe it off on a paper towel. Then lightly brush over the area that you want. As you can see, after only a few seconds, it's effortlessly highlighted all the details. This is a really great technique for beginners and can be really satisfying. So now that we've finished the painting, we're going to add the decal to the instrument panel. Here's the decal sheet and we're looking for number 1. What I'm using here is the Trumpeter decal tray. This is a simple tool which allows you to raise the decals out of the water. It's a bit gimmicky, but it's definitely useful. You could also just use a plate, bowl, or anything that holds a small amount of water. Cut out the decal using scissors and place it face down in the water to stop it curling up. and leave it for around a minute. Whilst that's soaking, let's look at some decal solutions. Here I have Microset and Sol, which are chemicals that help a decal conform to the part's surface, giving them a painted on look. I'll be covering these in more depth in the decaling episode. So for the instrument panel, it's up to you whether you use these or just use water. Microset in blue will soften the decal and improve adhesion, whilst Microsol in red will help a decal conform to a more irregular surface. Most people will use Microset first, and then if the decal won't sit into the details properly, they come in with Microsol to further persuade it. I have a dedicated brush for each to prevent contamination. Brush the Microset onto the instrument panel and then carefully place the decal in the correct position. You'll know the decal is ready when it starts to slide off the backing paper. For this, I'm simply going to brush on some more Microset on top of the decal and then leave it to dry overnight. In the process, the decal will sink down and conform to the shape of the panel. You could also use a cotton bud to gently press down the decal and further push it into the details. Now we've finished painting, we can move on to some simple weathering. But first we need to seal in the paintwork. To do this, we're going to add a varnish layer. I'll be using Tamiya X22 Clear. A clear varnish is used for surface protection and will leave you with a gloss finish, which is perfect for the next steps. To apply the clear varnish, we'll mix it 1 to 3 with X20A. This will give us a good starting point for the viscosity. If it doesn't flow well through the airbrush, add a few more drops of thinner. I like to fill these dropper bottles from Amazon with pre-thinned varnish, which makes life a lot easier. Spraying it between 15 to 20 psi, apply the varnish in light, even coats over the part. You can use the light reflection to see where it lands, and be cautious not to flood the surface. This is the result after 2 coats, leaving 10 minutes between each layer and then overnight to fully cure. X22 dries quicker than most varnishes, and a blast from a hairdryer will help it cure even faster, but I would say it's best to leave it at least an hour before applying anything on top of it. And of course you can experiment with this and figure out what works for you. With a varnish layer on top of the paint, the surface is ready for a weathering wash. A wash is paint that has been heavily diluted with thinners. This means it will flow in gaps, cracks, and in the corner of details, imitating the buildup of dirt and grime. It's a simple way to achieve a weathered look and is perfect for a beginner. I'm using the deep grey enamel wash from Ammo. I have a small round brush dedicated to enamel washes, again to prevent contamination. It's a good idea to decant a small amount of the wash into a shot cup, as it's easier to keep the wash well mixed. Apply the wash into the corners and around the details. It should flow easily. Try not to add too much, as it'll be harder to clean up once it's dried. Leave the wash for a few hours or go over it with a hairdryer until it becomes visibly dry. When you've applied it to all the parts, wash out the brush using an enamel cleaner. I use the same liquid as I use to clean the airbrush, Mr. Colour Thinner. Now we can clean it up with a cotton bud. Pressing gently on the surface, the cotton bud will remove the wash from the open and flat surfaces, but leave it in the corners. Replicating buildup of dirt in real life. If the wash doesn't come off, you can dampen the cotton bud in odourless thinners. This is a less powerful thinner that will be enough to remove the wash but not damage the paint. If you take off too much, simply go back and add more wash and repeat the process until you're happy with it. Once you're satisfied with how it looks, we need to seal the wash in. For this, you can use a varnish of your choice. But remember, not only are you protecting the wash, you're setting the type of finish for the cockpit. In most cases, I would use either a matte or satin varnish, but it's entirely up to you. I'll be using VMS Satin with VMS Acrylic Thinners 2.0. This is the recommended thinner. You can apply the varnish straight from the bottle, but I like to add some thinner because it gives you a better flow through the airbrush. These give a great finish and are really easy to use. Add a few drops of thinner into the airbrush, followed by a few drops of the varnish. Then mix them in the airbrush by holding your finger over the nozzle and pulling back on the trigger. Apply the varnish in light coats until you start to see the shine go dull. Once you've got a uniform satin or matte finish, then you've applied enough. Do this for all the cockpit parts, making sure not to apply it too heavily. To clean the airbrush after using these varnishes, I tend to use a few drops of the thinner 2.0 to remove the excess varnish in the colour cup. Then afterwards I use the usual airbrush cleaner to remove the rest. If you've been using an acrylic varnish, you need to use an acrylic thinner or cleaner to wash it out. Once you've got the majority of the acrylic varnish out, you can then use the solvent cleaner to clean up the rest of the airbrush. Finally, we can start to assemble the cockpit. To glue the painted parts together, we simply need to find the contact points between them. The instructions will show you where they connect, but you can test it out for yourself to see what would be the strongest. In some cases, the extra thin cement can remove the paint, so it's best to apply it in a small pinpoint fashion and rely on the capillary action to spread the glue. Also, try to put it in areas you won't see. For example, on the seat, applying it at the bottom contact point is far better than at the top, as the top of the seat will be clearly visible on the final model. So a botched glue application is what we want to avoid here. Whilst the seat dries, we can attach the instrument panel. This is nice and easy with 2 locating pins. It goes together with a click and we can drop in some glue from the back. After a few minutes, we can mount the seat to the former. I found that the 2 upper pins needed to be shortened by just less than a millimeter in order to achieve the desired fit. So test it out on your kit, and if it doesn't sit where you want it, you may need to do the same. This was done by simply snipping off the plastic. Then I applied Tamiya cement to the 2 upper pins and put them in their respective locating holes. Once they are in place, I used extra thin quickset to glue the bottom pins. Make sure you leave the seat to fully harden. This is quite a fragile assembly, so further applications of extra thin cement might be required. Moving on to step 9, we start to assemble the cockpit tub. The instructions call for the instrument panel former to be mounted on the left sidewall. You might find it to be a tight fit after multiple paint layers, so a neat trick to solve this is to scrape off the paint layer on the locating tab. Be careful to only remove the paint from where the parts interlock. Then try again and it should slot in with ease. To make sure the alignment is correct, we can also dry fit the right side. This will act as a jig whilst gluing. Now just apply the extra thin to the back of the joint and leave it to dry. Once that's properly hardened, we can take off the right sidewall and install the control column frame into the lower section. Look closely at the instructions to make sure it goes in the correct place. Once the side pin is locked in, it'll help you align it onto the lower part of the instrument panel. Now we can add the right sidewall and apply some glue to the back of the joint as we did on the left. I'm going to assemble the cockpit in a slightly different way to the instructions. Once the 2 sidewalls are glued firmly to the instrument panel, I'm going to slot in all the other pieces without applying glue. You should be able to assemble most of the remaining pieces using friction. This means that we can spend some time checking everything fits exactly where it should and adjust it as required. For the rear bulkhead, we have to apply some moderate pressure to make sure the two halves fit where they should. Using the quick set and holding it with your fingers will be enough. Once all the gaps are closed and everything is aligned properly, apply extra thin cement to the back of all the joints and leave it to dry. Adding the front bulkhead completes the cockpit tub. Now we can test fit it into the fuselage halves and see how the cockpit looks fully assembled. And that concludes the first chapter. We've learnt how to precisely cut out and clean up parts and assemble them accurately using a range of cements. We then painted the cockpit using the airbrush and some basic brush painting techniques. Finally, we added some weathering to the cockpit using an enamel wash, and demonstrated good practices by protecting our paint layers with different varnishes. Now we have a high quality, complete Spitfire cockpit, ready to be assembled into the fuselage in the next chapter.